Captain James McFerrin had 19,000 flight hours, more time in the cockpit than most pilots would accumulate in 3 careers. On September 25, 1978, all that experience made him confident enough to ignore a warning that would have saved 144 lives. The Cessna was exactly where the controller said it would be. McFerrin just never looked down. San Diego's Lindbergh Field had been a disaster waiting to happen since the day it opened. Everyone knew it. Air traffic controllers knew it. Pilots knew it. The Federal Aviation Administration knew it. The airport sat wedged between downtown high-rises and residential neighborhoods, with approach paths that sliced directly through the busiest general aviation training corridor in California. But knowing something is dangerous and actually doing something about it, those are two very different things. September 25, 1978 started like any other Monday morning in San Diego. Clear skies, 72 degrees, light winds out of the west, perfect flying weather, the kind of morning that makes you forget that commercial aviation is controlled chaos held together by strict adherence to procedures that exist because people died. Pacific Southwest Airlines Flight 182 was a milk run. Sacramento to San Diego, 1 hour and 13 minutes of routine flying. The Boeing 727 had made this exact flight thousands of times. Captain McFerrin had flown it more times than he could count. At the controls that morning, McFerrin, age 53. First Officer Robert Fox, age 42. Flight Engineer Martin Wan, age 44. Combined, the 3 men had over 35,000 hours of flight time. These weren't rookies. These weren't the kind of pilots who made stupid mistakes. Or so everyone thought. 4 miles northeast of Lindbergh Field, a Cessna 172 was doing touch-and-go landings at Montgomery Field. Student pilot David Boswell, age 35, and his flight instructor Martin Casey Jr., age 32, were practicing instrument approaches. Standard training, the kind of flying that happens at every small airport in America, every single day. The Cessna's practice area overlapped perfectly with the approach corridor for Lindbergh Field's runway 27. Again, everyone knew this was dangerous. At 8:59 a.m., PSA 182 began its descent into San Diego. First Officer Fox was flying. Captain McFerrin was handling radio communications. Standard crew resource management, everything by the book. At 9:00 and 31 seconds, the approach controller gave them their first warning. PSA 182, traffic 12 o'clock, 1 mile, a Cessna. McFerrin responded immediately. Okay, we had it there a minute ago. Had it. Past tense. The controller continued. PSA 182, additional traffics, 12 o'clock, 3 miles, just north of the field, northwest, a Cessna 172 climbing VFR out of 1,400. VFR. Visual Flight Rules. Meaning the Cessna pilot was responsible for seeing and avoiding other aircraft. But so was the PSA crew. The principle is called see and avoid, and it's the foundation of aviation safety when aircraft are operating under visual conditions. Everyone is responsible for not hitting everyone else. Simple, right? At 9:01 and 38 seconds, McFerrin reported visual contact. Traffic in sight. The controller acknowledged. Okay, sir. Maintain visual separation. Contact Lindbergh Tower, 133.3. Maintain visual separation. 3 words. A direct instruction. You see the traffic, you are now responsible for not hitting it. McFerrin switched frequencies to the tower. Lindbergh Tower, PSA 182 downwind. The tower controller replied. PSA 182, Lindbergh Tower. Traffic, 12 o'clock, 1 mile, a Cessna. Second warning. McFerrin, confident, almost casual. Is that the one we're following? That's a firm. Okay. Third warning in 90 seconds. 3 separate controllers, all saying the same thing. Traffic, 12 o'clock. Cessna. At 9:01 and 47 seconds, the controller gave clearance. PSA 182, cleared to land. Inside the PSA cockpit, the crew was relaxed. First Officer Fox mentioned the Cessna. "He's passing off to our right." Flight Engineer 1 agreed. "Yeah, there was just one problem. The Cessna wasn't passing off to their right. It was directly below them, invisible beneath the Boeing's nose, climbing into the exact piece of sky the PSA jet was descending through." The approach controller, watching his radar scope, saw what the PSA crew couldn't. The two targets were converging. Fast. At 9:01 and 51 seconds, he transmitted the fourth warning. PSA 182, traffic's at 12 o'clock, 3 miles, out of 1,700. McFerrin, still confident. Got M. He didn't have them. He had spotted a different Cessna entirely. A Cessna that was, indeed, safely off to the right. Meanwhile, the actual traffic, the Cessna 172 with Boswell and Casey aboard, was less than 400 feet below, invisible, climbing. What happened in the next 7 seconds would kill 144 people and change aviation regulations forever. But we'll come back to those 7 seconds. Because to understand how this happened, you need to understand what the people on the ground saw. If you're enjoying this deep dive into aviation disasters and institutional failures, hit that like button. It tells YouTube to share this with people who appreciate real research and actual facts. Paula Blake was 25 years old, driving east on Dwight Street in the North Park neighborhood. She was less than a mile from Lindbergh Field. Aircraft flew over her neighborhood constantly. She didn't even notice them anymore. Until she noticed this one. In a 2003 interview, Blake recalled, "I looked up and saw the Cessna. It was climbing. Then I saw the PSA jet coming in for landing. They were going to hit. I could see it happening. I started screaming at my windshield like they could hear me. Like I could stop it. She couldn't stop it. Nobody could." Inside the Cessna, David Boswell and Martin Casey had no idea a Boeing 727 was descending on top of them. The high wing configuration of the Cessna 172 meant the aircraft above them was in a massive blind spot. They were flying instruments, focused on their practice approach, doing everything their training required. Inside the PSA cockpit, Captain McFerrin and First Officer Fox believed the traffic was safely off to their right. They'd reported visual contact. The controller had cleared him to land. Everything was fine. Except nothing was fine. At 9:02 and 4 seconds, Flight Engineer 1 saw it first. His voice, suddenly urgent on the cockpit voice recorder. "There's one underneath." First Officer Fox, realizing, "I was looking at that inbound there." Captain McFerrin, the terrible understanding flooding through him. "Oh yeah." Before he could move the controls, before he could turn, before he could climb, before he could do anything at all, the Boeing 727's right wing sliced through the Cessna 172 at 244 miles per hour. The Cessna disintegrated. Instantly. The cockpit severed from the fuselage. Both occupants died before their brains could process what was happening. The wreckage tumbled through the air like shredded paper. The PSA jet's wing was catastrophically damaged. The leading edge was crushed. The number 7 slat tore away completely. Hydraulic lines severed. Fuel lines ruptured. On the cockpit voice recorder, Captain McFerrin's voice. Calm. Professional. Already dead but not knowing it yet. "Tower, we're going down. This is PSA. The tower controller, confused. "Okay, we'll call the equipment for you." 7 seconds of radio silence. 7 seconds while 135 passengers and crew members experienced something no human being should ever experience. Conscious. Aware. Falling. Then, Captain McFerrin's final transmission. "This is it, baby." Followed by First Officer Fox. "Bob." Then nothing. Just the sound of wind. Of metal tearing. Of hydraulic systems failing. of an aircraft that was never designed to fly in this configuration, trying desperately to fly anyway. The Boeing 727 entered a right roll that the crew couldn't stop. The flight controls were gone. The aircraft nosed over into a steep dive. It was descending through 2,800 feet. Accelerating 300 miles per hour. 350, 400. People on the ground watched it fall. Robert Benner was working in his yard on Boundary Street. The plane was on fire. You could see people in the windows. I swear to God you could see their faces. They all knew what was about to happen. Kathy Jackson was walking her dog. It sounded like a freight train. This roaring sound that kept getting louder. When it hit, the explosion was so loud I thought it was an earthquake. Flight attendant Deborah McCarthy was in the rear galley. Unlike the cockpit crew, the flight attendants had no idea what was happening until the aircraft rolled violently to the right. Passengers started screaming. McCarthy grabbed the public address system. She never got to make an announcement. The Boeing 727 struck the ground at Dwight and Nile Streets at 9:02 and 47 seconds. 43 seconds after the collision. 43 seconds of knowing. The impact was catastrophic. The fuselage disintegrated on contact. The fuel tanks, nearly full for the short flight, exploded in a fireball visible from 20 miles away. The momentum carried burning wreckage through houses, cars, trees, power lines. A quarter-mile path of total destruction carved through a residential neighborhood on a Monday morning. 135 people aboard PSA Flight 182. Dead. 2 people aboard the Cessna 172. Dead. 7 people on the ground, in their homes, in their yards, driving to work. Dead. 144 people. Gone. Because experienced pilots ignored repeated warnings. But here's what you need to understand. This wasn't a story about bad pilots. McFerrin wasn't incompetent. Fox wasn't reckless. These were professionals with spotless records. Thousands of hours. Decades of experience. So what went wrong? Stick around, because the answer is going to make you question every safety system you've ever trusted. The fire department arrived within 4 minutes. It didn't matter. The temperature at the impact site exceeded 1,800 degrees. Nothing survived. Bodies were incinerated beyond recognition. The entire crash site was roughly the size of 4 city blocks, but the actual impact zone was concentrated in an area smaller than a football field. Fire Captain Carlos Escobar was first on scene. In a 1984 interview, he described what he found. "I've been a firefighter for 22 years. I fought fires in Vietnam. I thought I'd seen everything. This was different. This wasn't a crash site. It was a crematorium. We found pieces. That's all. Just pieces." The largest intact section of the Boeing 727 was a portion of the fuselage measuring approximately 6 feet long. Everything else was fragments. Seat cushions, luggage, metal twisted into shapes that didn't look like they'd ever been part of an aircraft. Investigators later determined that the impact force exceeded 90 Gs. The human body can survive approximately 25 Gs for a fraction of a second under perfect conditions. At 90 Gs, bones shatter. Organs rupture. The body doesn't just die. It ceases to exist as a functional structure. 144 people experienced that. Meanwhile, 3 miles away at Lindbergh Tower, controllers were trying to understand what had just happened. The radar scope showed PSA 182's transponder code disappear. One sweep of the radar, the target was there. Next sweep, gone. Approach controller David Lee was the last person to speak to Captain McFerrin. "I saw it on the scope. The 2 targets merged. Then one vanished. I knew immediately. I just knew. But your brain doesn't want to accept it. You keep hoping maybe it's a transponder failure. Maybe they landed on a freeway. Maybe somehow, impossibly, they're okay. They weren't okay. Nothing about this was okay." The National Transportation Safety Board investigation began within hours. Investigators faced an unusual problem. They had too much information. The cockpit voice recorder captured everything. The flight data recorder documented every control input. Air traffic control recordings preserved every radio transmission. Eyewitnesses saw the collision happen in clear daylight. There was no mystery about what happened. The mystery was why. Lead investigator James Danaher reviewed the cockpit voice recorder transcript dozens of times. McFerrin reported traffic in sight. He said, "Got M," when the controller gave him the final warning. He believed he was looking at the right aircraft. The question isn't whether he lied. The question is how an experienced captain could misidentify traffic that was in the exact position the controller specified. The answer came from a series of vision experiments conducted by the University of Southern California's Aviation Psychology Department. Human vision is not a camera. We don't see everything in our field of view equally. We see what we expect to see. We see what we're looking for. And when we find something that matches our expectations, our brain stops searching. Captain McFerrin expected to see a Cessna off to his right, based on First Officer Fox's earlier comment. When he looked and saw a Cessna off to the right, his brain said, "Found it," and stopped processing. The fact that there was a second Cessna, the actual traffic the controller was warning him about, directly below his aircraft, his brain never looked for it because his brain had already found what it was searching for. Psychologists call this confirmation bias. Pilots call it target fixation. The NTSB called it a contributing factor in the deadliest aviation disaster in California history. But there's more. Because the pilots weren't the only ones who made mistakes that morning. The approach controller who handed PSA 182 off to the tower, he watched the two targets converge on his radar scope. He gave warnings, but he never issued what's called a safety alert. He never said the words, "climb immediately," or "turn left immediately." He gave information. He didn't give commands. Why not? Because the regulations didn't require it. Once a pilot reports visual contact with traffic and is told to maintain visual separation, the controller's job is done. The pilot is responsible. The controller has no authority to override that. The system assumed that experienced pilots who report traffic in sight have actually seen the correct traffic. The system assumed wrong. In the months following the crash, the NTSB interviewed dozens of pilots, controllers, and aviation safety experts. The consensus was universal. Everyone knew Lindbergh Field's approach path was dangerous. Everyone knew the overlap with general aviation training areas created unacceptable risk. The FAA had received multiple recommendations to create a terminal control area around San Diego that would require all aircraft to have positive radar contact and controller clearance. These recommendations dated back to 1973. 5 years of warnings. 5 years of reports. 5 years of experts saying, "This is going to kill people." The FAA's response: the airline industry objected to the additional regulations. General aviation operators objected to restrictions on training flights. Creating a TCA would be expensive, complicated, politically difficult. So they didn't do it. Until September 25, 1978, when 144 people paid the price for that decision. If this kind of detailed research into institutional failures is valuable to you, consider subscribing. We're documenting the disasters that changed regulations, one ignored warning at a time. The NTSB's final report was published in April 1979. 7 months of investigation, 2,300 pages of testimony, analysis, and technical documentation. The probable cause: failure of the flight crew to comply with the provisions of maintain visual separation clearance, including the requirement to inform the controller when they no longer had the other aircraft in sight. Translation: the pilots didn't do their job. But the NTSB didn't stop there. They issued findings that went far beyond pilot error. Finding number 1. The see and avoid concept has inherent limitations when applied to high-speed aircraft in congested airspace. Finding number 2. The absence of a terminal control area at San Diego created unacceptable risk. Finding number 3. Controller procedures for issuing safety alerts were inadequate. Finding number 4. The FAA had failed to implement previously recommended safety improvements that could have prevented this accident. That last finding. That's the important one. Because it meant the NTSB was saying, officially, in a federal document, that the government agency responsible for aviation safety had ignored warnings and people died. Exactly the kind of institutional negligence your audience expects. Exactly the kind of vindication story that proves the experts were right all along. The FAA's response was immediate and comprehensive. Within 60 days, San Diego became one of the first cities in the United States to receive Terminal Control Area designation. All aircraft operating within the TCA, regardless of size or type, were required to have functioning transponders and maintain two-way radio contact with air traffic control. Visual separation rules were revised. Controllers were given expanded authority to issue safety alerts even when pilots had reported traffic in sight. Training programs were overhauled to address confirmation bias and target fixation. Nationwide, the accident prompted the development of the Traffic Alert and Collision Avoidance System, or TCAS, which became mandatory on all commercial aircraft by the 1990s. TCAS uses transponders to detect nearby aircraft and provides automatic resolution advisories, telling pilots exactly which direction to turn or climb to avoid collision. In other words, the system stopped trusting human eyes and human judgment. The system that everyone knew was dangerous before PSA 182 crashed. That system was finally fixed. Cost: 144 lives. But let's talk about the people who survived to see those changes. Not the passengers, because there were no survivors from the aircraft. But the controllers, the witnesses, the first responders, the investigators. David Lee, the approach controller, retired from air traffic control in 1981. 3 years after the crash. He gave one interview, in 1997, nearly 20 years later. I hear those transmissions in my sleep. McFerrin saying, got M. Me believing him, watching the targets merge on the scope. People ask if I blame myself. I don't know how to answer that. I followed every procedure. I gave every warning I was authorized to give. But I watched it happen. I saw it coming, and I couldn't stop it. Fire Captain Escobar developed post-traumatic stress disorder. He completed his career, retired with honors, and refused to ever discuss the crash again after his initial statements to investigators. Paula Blake, the witness who watched from her car, moved out of San Diego within 6 months. I couldn't drive down that street. I couldn't look at airplanes. Every time I heard a jet overhead, I was back in my car, screaming at people who couldn't hear me, watching something I couldn't stop. The families of the victims filed lawsuits against PSA, Cessna, the FAA, and the air traffic controllers. The litigation took 7 years to resolve. PSA and its insurers paid over $21 million in settlements. The FAA, protected by sovereign immunity, paid nothing. In 1986, a memorial was dedicated at the crash site. A simple plaque listing 144 names. No explanation, no details, just names. Because sometimes the names are enough. Captain McFerrin's widow, Barbara, attended the dedication. She gave a brief statement. Jim was a good pilot. He loved flying. He loved PSA. He made a mistake. I know that. Everyone knows that. But he wasn't a bad person. He wasn't reckless. He was human. And humans make mistakes. She was right. Humans do make mistakes. But here's the thing about aviation. The mistakes kill everyone. Not just the person who made the error. Everyone. That's why the regulations exist. That's why the procedures exist. That's why controllers give warnings 4 separate times even when pilots say they have traffic in sight. Because in aviation, there is no such thing as a small mistake. The wreckage of PSA Flight 182 was collected, catalogued, and eventually scrapped. Pieces were retained for training purposes. The cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorder are stored at NTSB headquarters in Washington, D.C., where they're used to teach investigators how to analyze human factors in aviation accidents. The Cessna 172 was completely destroyed. No major components were recovered intact. The aircraft's logbooks survived because they were stored at Montgomery Field, not aboard the aircraft. They showed a perfectly maintained airplane, flown by qualified pilots, doing exactly what they were supposed to be doing. 2 pilots doing their jobs correctly. 3 airline crew members doing their jobs correctly. Controllers doing their jobs correctly. And still, 144 people died. How is that possible? Because the system was broken. Everyone working within the system followed the rules. But the rules themselves were inadequate. The see and avoid principle that worked fine in 1945, when aircraft were slower and airspace was less congested, didn't work in 1978 when jets were approaching airports at 250 miles per hour through training corridors filled with Cessnas. The experts knew this. The reports documented it. The recommendations spelled it out. And the FAA, under pressure from airlines and general aviation lobbies, did nothing. Until they couldn't ignore it anymore. In 2007, the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum opened an exhibit on aviation safety. PSA Flight 182 was featured prominently. The exhibit included portions of the cockpit voice recorder transcript, photographs of the crash site, and a detailed timeline of the warnings given and ignored. The final panel of the exhibit asked a simple question. Could this happen today? The answer, according to aviation safety experts, is no. TCAS would have alerted both aircraft to the conflict 30 seconds before impact. The terminal control area designation means both aircraft would have been in positive radar contact with controllers who could have directed them to different altitudes. Modern crew resource management training specifically addresses confirmation bias and target fixation. The system that failed in 1978 has been rebuilt from the ground up. Because 144 people proved it didn't work. On September 25, every year, a small group gathers at the memorial in North Park. Families of victims, aviation safety advocates, retired controllers and pilots. They don't make speeches. They don't hold ceremonies. They just stand there, reading the names, remembering the day the sky fell on a San Diego neighborhood. 144 names. 144 people who woke up that Monday morning expecting to go to work, visit family, start another ordinary week. 144 people who died because experienced professionals made the same mistake humans have been making since the beginning of time. We see what we expect to see. We find what we're looking for. And once we've found it, we stop searching. Captain McFerrin expected the traffic to be off to his right. When he saw a Cessna off to his right, he stopped looking. He reported, "Got M," with complete confidence because he genuinely believed he was looking at the correct aircraft. He was wrong. And being wrong at 244 miles per hour, at 1,400 feet, over a residential neighborhood, doesn't give you time to correct the mistake. 7 seconds. That's how long elapsed between Flight Engineer 1 saying, "There's one underneath," and the moment of impact. 7 seconds of realization. 7 seconds of understanding. 7 seconds of knowing that every warning, every procedure, every rule they'd ignored or misunderstood was about to kill everyone. The last sound on the cockpit voice recorder isn't screaming. It's not praying. It's not panic. It's silence. Just the wind. The terrible rushing wind of an aircraft falling out of the sky. And then impact. Investigators who listened to the full cockpit voice recorder, not just the portions released to the public, reported one additional detail. In the final 2 seconds before impact, you can hear Captain McFerrin breathing. Just breathing. Fast, shallow breaths of a man who knows exactly what's about to happen and is completely powerless to stop it. That's what confirmation bias costs. That's what institutional negligence costs. That's what ignoring expert warnings for 5 years costs. 144 people learned that lesson. The rest of us, we inherited a safer system built on their deaths. Every time you board a commercial flight and hear the TCAS system activate, preventing a collision you never knew was coming, you're benefiting from what PSA Flight 182 taught the aviation industry. Every time controllers in a terminal control area vector aircraft to maintain separation, they're following procedures written in response to 144 deaths. Every time pilots receive training on confirmation bias and target fixation, they're learning from Captain McFerrin's fatal mistake. The system learned. The system adapted. The system changed. But the people are still dead. That's the thing about disasters caused by institutional negligence. The improvements always come after. The regulations are always written in blood. The experts are always vindicated too late. The FAA knew San Diego needed a terminal control area. They had the reports. They had the data. They had 5 years of warnings. They waited until 144 people died. Then they acted. Captain James McFerrin, First Officer Robert Fox, and Flight Engineer Martin Wan made a mistake. They reported traffic in sight when they were looking at the wrong aircraft. That mistake was the immediate cause of the collision. But the reason that mistake was possible, the reason the system allowed that mistake to be fatal, the reason 144 people died instead of 0, that's on the FAA. That's on the institutions that ignored the warnings. That's on everyone who knew the approach to Lindbergh Field was dangerous and did nothing. The controllers knew. The pilots knew. The safety experts knew. The reports documented it. The recommendations spelled it out. And everyone who had the power to change it decided it was easier to do nothing. Until they couldn't ignore it anymore. Until the bodies were on the ground. Until the cameras were rolling. Until the nation was watching. Then, suddenly, all those expensive, complicated, politically difficult changes became possible. Funny how that works. PSA Flight 182 fell out of the sky at 9:02 and 47 seconds a.m. on September 25, 1978. 144 people died in 43 seconds. The investigation took 7 months. The regulations were changed within 60 days. The lawsuits took 7 years. The memorial was dedicated 8 years later. The families still gather every September. Reading the names. Remembering the day. Knowing that their loved ones died, proving something everyone already knew. That Lindbergh Field was dangerous. That the see and avoid principle was inadequate. That sooner or later, somebody was going to die. They were right. All of them. Every expert who warned. Every controller who reported near misses. Every pilot who complained about the congested airspace. They were right. And 144 people paid the price for being ignored. That's the real story of PSA Flight 182. Not that pilots make mistakes. Everyone knows pilots are human. Mistakes happen. The real story is that the system knew those mistakes were coming. Knew they would be fatal. Knew exactly what needed to be done to prevent them. And chose to wait. Until the sky fell on North Park. Until the wreckage covered 4 city blocks. Until 144 names needed to be carved into a memorial. Then, and only then, the system changed. That's not a failure of pilots. That's a failure of institutions. That's a failure of leadership. That's a failure of everyone who had the power to prevent this and chose not to act. Captain McFerrin had 19,000 flight hours. He was wrong about which Cessna he was looking at. That mistake killed him and 143 other people. The FAA had 5 years of warnings. They were wrong to ignore them. That mistake killed 144 people. Both made fatal errors. Only one of them knew it was coming. September 25, 1978. 9:02 a.m. A beautiful Monday morning in San Diego. 7 seconds that changed aviation forever. 144 people who never came home. And a system that finally, belatedly, learned what the experts had been saying all along. The controllers were right. The safety advocates were right. The reports were right. They were just proven right too late. That's the price of institutional negligence. That's the cost of ignored warnings. That's what happens when people with power choose convenience over safety. 144 names on a memorial. 144 families who remember. 144 reasons the system finally changed. PSA Flight 182. The disaster everyone saw coming. Except the people who could have stopped it. Until they couldn't ignore it anymore.